When you were growing up, did your parents ever tell you you're not going to act like that? You're part of this family? Your parents weren't saying, well, if you act like that, then you're not part of this family and you got to leave, kicking you out of the family. They never did that. But they told you that because you're part of this, there's a certain kind of way that is consistent with the way we live in this house. Pastor Tim Holscher, and we're looking at the ministry of regeneration. We're looking at the fact that we have been joined to God the Father by the work of the Spirit, so that the Father dwells in us now, and by his indwelling us, we have become his children. 1 John 5:1, whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ is born from God. So we've been born from God as his children. That gives us potentials, which we've looked at. In Ephesians 5:1, we have the potential to be imitators of God as his beloved children, that is, to exhibit love in the same way that he exhibits love. And so we've been looking at some of these examples. We turn to 1 Peter chapter 1 today. And Peter is writing to believers that in his opening verses, you find out that these people have been scattered throughout the world. And being scattered, they're, shall we say, to use one of the popular words today, they have been marginalized. And this life is hard for them now that they're scattered out among all these people, scattered from their homes. And Peter's encouraging them that simply because you're scattered does not make it acceptable for you to do certain or behave in certain ways. So in verse 14, he says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance. Notice he says he addresses them as or like obedient children. Obedient children are not to be conformed to the former lusts, the former cravings that were part of their life, the former lusts. But he says they were lusts that were done in your ignorance. You didn't know any better. You were unsaved at that time. That was the only kind of life that you knew. You didn't have anything else. But now that you're a child of God, you have a new way of living. And so he says, don't conform to those things. But like the Holy One who called you, or the one that called you is holy, be holy yourselves in all of your behavior. Now, we've got all kinds of crazy ideas of what holy means, but the word simply means to be set apart. And in reality, almost all the time when it occurs, it's pretty clear that it's being set apart to God. Therefore, it's kind of a way of saying here, and I don't want to minimize the idea of holiness, but it's like because you're God's child, you act like God's child. That's what he's telling you. Act like my child. Be holy. Be set apart to me. I'm the parent. I'm the father. And there's a certain way that I desire for you to live. Now, we don't want to cross the bridge or cross the line over into what we would call legalism. But just because God has a, shall we say, a standard or something, a way that he would like for us to live, that doesn't make it very clear. That doesn't have to make it legalism. He's just saying, don't be conformed to this other way of life. You didn't know any better, but you know better now. There's a better way of living as obedient children. Being a child of God is way better than the life that you had before. Maybe you don't enjoy some of the perks that the world offers you, but those things pale in comparison. I don't know if you remember, but it's been quite some time back in these studies. We looked at 1 John chapter 2 and verse 17, where it says, the world is passing away and its stuff. This is passing away. So what do you want to invest your life in all of this? Or just chase after the cravings that come from your own flesh and you just pursue those cravings? Those aren't healthy. Those aren't going to be beneficial for you. But you can live as an obedient child, not being conformed, and you can be holy. To me, it's interesting. This is Peter writing this, and he's also the one that writes 2 Peter. In 2 Peter, he says something very similar. He says, for by these he has granted or given to us his precious or valuable and the greatest. We have this word magnificent. We've been over this before. It's a superlative form of the word great. So that would be greatest promises, so that by them you may become partakers of those that fellowship of. Remember, it's not the divine nature, because you're not God. You never will be God. You'll never even be a little God. But you, as a human being, as a creation, you can share in the kind of nature that God has. But then the last part of this says, when you share in this divine nature, that is in the context of one that has escaped or is escaping at that moment the corruption that is in the world in the form of lusts. That is, you can't be living out as a sharer in the divine nature and living out in your lusts at exactly the same moment in time. You are always a child of God, but you don't always live like a child of God. And you're not always, when he says partakers, that word fellowship means you're actually actively sharing it in common. If I bake a pan of brownies for you and I hand some brownies, I say, have a brownie. I'll share my brownies with you. And you turn them down. Are we sharing brownies? I've tried to share them with you, but unless you are eating one, we're not sharing them. Likewise, we can have a possession of this kind of nature that we get from God as his child, but unless we're actively using it, we're not sharing it at that moment in time. It's just a thing that we have. And so we have to be those that are escaping the corruption that is in the world in the form of lust. We have to be having victory or freedom from our sinful nature in order for us to be sharing in this nature. When we're doing that, when we're having victory, when we are experiencing this freedom, then guess what? Then we can share in this nature. And that to me is very interesting that this is really kind of what Peter says over here also in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 14. It's actually that you're an obedient child. And because you're an obedient child, don't be conformed to those lusts. That would be an obedient child. You're not being an obedient child when you are conforming to those lusts. It's when you are not being conformed to those. And then you can be holy. You're not being holy to God when you're engaged in these lusts. Because, as we close, because you're a child of God, and because of the relationship to Christ as well as the work of the Spirit, but just in this context here, because you're a child of God, you have the potential to actually be an obedient child of God. It's one more aspect that God's added in our Christian life that if you understand this, you'd say this is another way that he's, not a different way, but another aspect of how he is providing us freedom from being dominated by our own sinful nature that frustrates so many of us as Christians. And we have this ability to be holy. And I trust that encourages you. Hey, I'm a child of God today, and I can live like a child of God because I am free from the dominion of my cravings. I'm free from those things because I, in Christ, died with Christ to the sin nature, but I'm alive unto God. And because I'm free, I can live holy as one of God's children. And when you're doing that, I know for sure that it'll encourage you in having a good day in the Lord. Thank you for joining me today.